from. So today we have two speakers, and both of them eminent specialists or in the issue of memory and the politics of history, an everlasting theme that seems never to lose its topicality in Southeastern Europe, and in particular in the former Yugoslavia. So from Regensburg it will be Ger Duijzings, who is a social anthropologist at our Department of Southeast and East European History, who joined us, when was it, 5 years ago? I think
it's already 6.
Already 6 years ago, yeah. Coming from the School for Slavonic and East European Studies at the UCL in London, and he's going to talk about perpetrators as victims in Eastern Bosnia towards an anthropology of dark emotions, drawing on his extensive research, also field research in Bosnia, and his research on the memory of genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The second speaker is going to be a historian, actually, Vjeran Pavlaković, who has a PhD in history, and who is part of the Department of Cultural Studies at the Philosophical Faculty in Rijeka, and I think also one of those colleagues who really don't need a lot of, in terms of introduction, well known by his publications on the politics of history in Croatia, and with a special interest in monuments. But maybe I should also mention that Vjeran has also published on volunteers in the Spanish Civil War. And he's going to talk about something that is really very, very topical and current: commemorations and the Corona crisis, and with added topicality because, as we all know, Croatia only 3 days ago elected a new parliament, and as usual, the politics of history also played an important role in the election campaign. So I think basically that we could start, and I would hand the Zoom floor over to Ger Duijzings, who will be the first speaker. Huh? So I'll stop my presentation, then you should be able to share
and
yours.
I will, wait a minute, it's quite a complicated operation. Wait a minute, where's the, here you are. And first I need to share, which is this one. Now, I'm not sure what you see now.
Yeah, we do see something.
See everything, huh?
Not everything, but it's a presentation.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, perfect.
So back to the
perfect
to the first one. Okay. And now, yeah, sorry, I need to make this small. Okay. Yeah. I actually, of course, realized that this is quite an appropriate moment to be talking about Srebrenica because of the 25th anniversary of the genocide. Although this was not designed as a talk about this anniversary. But yeah, what I would like to do is actually discuss my current research on Srebrenica under this particular title that you have in front of you. And a key statement that I would like to start with is this, that communities or individuals that regard themselves as victims of past conflicts and historical injustices can sometimes cultivate this victimhood status with such an intensity that they become perpetrators of horrific crimes. So this is the topic of my talk today: why perpetrators of atrocities such as the Srebrenica massacre or genocides often present themselves as victims and not as perpetrators. So, as I said, this is an outline of my current research on Srebrenica. And this lecture is actually a summary of a text that is about to be published, probably in a few months from now. It's my current research on Srebrenica that I kind of picked up again after a pause of 15 years or so. I mean, after I came to Regensburg, I again started to work on Srebrenica. But as probably many of you will know, between 1997 and 2002, I took part in this Dutch national inquiry carried out by the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation, the NIOD, in Amsterdam. And my task at that point was to write a local history on the basis of fieldwork that I did, oral history interviews, available open sources such as local press reports, and also archival sources, particularly dealing with World War II, but also archival sources dealing with the besieged enclave of Srebrenica 92-95, archives, for instance, from MSF, from Médecins Sans Frontières. And the book that I published, you see it here on the left-hand side, was basically an annex to the main NIOD report, which you see on your right-hand side. It looks kind of small on this slide, but it is actually huge, 3 volumes, 3,000 pages. And so my book, the left-hand cover, is basically an annex to the main NIOD report. And my book sort of presents a micro-history of Eastern Bosnia, particularly describing the descent into war at the beginning of the 1990s, although I also describe previous historical episodes, the 1980s, for example, I described in great detail. So now I'm revisiting my research, looking at the perpetrators. I mean, that's the idea of my current research, using the massive amount of new data produced in the Srebrenica trials at the ICTY, the Hague Tribunal. So here I'm trying to rethink and theoretically reflect on my earlier work, and I can say that somehow I've gone through some transformation in terms of how I want to approach the topic. My analysis will address 3 aspects. So I begin my reflection on this topic of perpetrators as victims by providing examples from the available perpetrator literature, which primarily deals, let's say, with Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. Next, I will discuss how scholars have usually explained the phenomenon by using cognitive models, focusing, for instance, on myths, on collective memories, on nationalist ideologies and propaganda. And third, I will argue that these cognitive models are not enough for a proper understanding. So I will draw attention here to the role of emotions, distinguishing between negative emotions such as grief and fear, which constitute a state of, let's say, passive suffering, and what I call toxic or dark emotions, which constitute an invitation, often collectively framed, to undo the humiliating status of victimhood, either real or perceived, justifying acts of revenge and retribution. So I will start with, by the way, this is an image of all the cases on Srebrenica at the ICTY. So you see it's quite a few. And the amount of material that I'm dealing with is around 400,000 pages just of transcripts, and then there's still a lot of other material that can be looked at. So, but let me start with Biljana Plavšić, as you probably know, a staunch Serb nationalist, the Iron Lady of the wartime Bosnian Serb leadership. And in The Hague, she pleaded guilty at her trial, stating, and I quote her statements, "It was a blinding fear that led to an obsession, especially for those of us for whom the Second World War was a living memory, that Serbs would never again allow themselves to become victims. In this obsession of ours to never again become victims, we allowed ourselves to become victimizers." So this is end of quote. And so initially, let's say this was part of a much longer declaration, a declaration that she made in front of the court. Her declaration was first welcomed, for example, by Slovenka Drakulić, but others argued more correctly that Plavšic's remorse was actually a cynical fraud aimed at reducing her sentence, and especially aimed at erasing the count of genocide from the indictment, which indeed happened in these negotiations at The Hague. In spite of the fact that Plavšić had been the most radical in her nationalist, if not racist, convictions. And her ideas and her inflammatory statements during the war, for example, indeed came very close to forming or shaping an ideology of genocidal intent on the part of the Bosnian Serb leadership. So she was one of the masterminds, let's say, behind things happening in Bosnia. In her memoirs, which she wrote while she was in prison, she explained that certain atrocities committed by the Serbs were indeed the regrettable but inevitable outcome of their previous victimization. And I'm quoting from these memoirs. She writes, "Suffering has its limits. When that limit is reached, then Srebrenica happens and victims become perpetrators of evil." End of quote. In spite of this realization, she, in her the same book, she reserves the highest praise for General Ratko Mladić, the key organizer of the Srebrenica genocide, whom she describes as a man with a clear compass. So her memoirs are replete with the theme of perpetual Serbian suffering, which is a dominant theme in Serb nationalist discourse, kind of chosen trauma, as the psychiatrist Vamik Vulkan calls it, which is fueled an ideology of resentment and revenge. Kosovo, the Kosovo myth being the key reference point here. The notion of Serbs being eternal victims has been a constant theme that was also activated during Yugoslavia's disintegration. And this provided a fertile breeding grounds and justification for violence against Muslims. And in my book, Religion, the Politics of Identity in Kosovo, I describe the Srebrenica genocide as an instance of Kosovo in the active mood, an invitation to undo historical injustices, to throw off the humiliating status of the victim and impose a kind of final solution, bringing justice and redemption. So from this one can draw some important lessons about the potentially toxic consequences of self-declared, real or imagined victimization. It often leads to forms of retribution which prolong violence. And as we know from the literature of Nazi perpetrators, the self-styled victim may retaliate, arguing that further victimization needs to be prevented by neutralizing the enemy who is out there to destroy us. The argument of tactical preemption, of hitting before the enemy will strike, is commonly mobilized by perpetrators. Although they may have various other motives for the violence they commit, they often prefer to present this as an unavoidable and necessary act of self-defense, curtailing sort of the lethal plans of a hostile opponent. In these narratives, mass killings become sort of prophylactic acts of group preservation in the face of an imagined ominous threat. And the only way to prevent the enemy of carrying out these plans is to overcome scruples and kill mercilessly. If we don't destroy them, they will destroy us, is a very common statement made in these contexts. So being ruthless is essential, otherwise we will have to fight them again in the next war. And this was indeed an argument Pavlaković used when she wrote that the Serbs were not prepared or are not prepared to continue to live with their Muslim neighbors. As every 30 years, I'm quoting from the memoirs again, if every 30 years, if not sooner, they will kill and slaughter us, as was the case in the 20th century, quote, end of quote. So at the end of the Bosnian War, Serbs indeed claimed that they were launching a preemptive war to prevent another genocide. This happened during World War II. And this had been spawned, as we all know, by years of propaganda, hate speech, scare tactics, which began shortly after Milosevic rose to power in the mid-1980s. And Serbian media, for example, showing no restraint whatsoever in displaying graphic images of mutilated bodies of Serb civilians, fallen victim to the campaigns organized by the Ustaše. For this kind of propaganda to be effective, it needs time, and inculcating existential fear is an essential ingredient, I would say. So it transforms the population into a state of mental preparation for conflicts to come. And it takes years for these ideas to mature in the collective mindset that the other has sinister intentions and may be about to launch an attack and endanger the survival of the group. Because of the propaganda, I would say individuals who never suffered any direct victimization may nevertheless generally feel victimized. So traumas can be transmitted in such a manner that following generations experience the historical injustices as if they suffered these themselves, through a kind of collapse of historical time. Or as Volkan argues, trauma is kind of deposited into the next generation, which keeps the desire for retaliation alive. Not only do perpetrators see themselves as victims, they also perceive their victims as perpetrators. So they deserve their destiny, even if they claim innocence. They must have done at least something wrong to have caused their suffering and their destiny, carrying direct or indirect responsibility for their own victimization. This is a very common theme also, for instance, in World War II. There's yet another way in which perpetrators can perceive themselves as victims. And I'm thinking here particularly also of Oppenheimer's The Act of Killing, this film that shows perpetrators in Indonesia. When they realize that killing leaves psychological scars, or when they feel forced to carry out the dirty work of killing, as a result of which they may become traumatized. So the sentiment of victimization may also be rooted in a pre-existing, pre-existing sentiments and victimization in terms other than the ideological framework suggests. People may have multiple reasons, completely unrelated to the war, for example, to feel victimized. And then these personal and collective forms of victimhood connect and intersect. So I will now turn to the, let's say, the study of emotions in this context, the emotional side of victimhood, and these two concepts of negative and dark emotions. So what I'm arguing is that mass atrocities are not only the outcome of, let's say, cultural, ideological priming or brainwashing. They are also generated by very strong emotional dispositions. And I would like to call these dispositions dark emotions, distinct from negative emotions mentioned earlier. So dark emotions such as rage and hatred are intense and eruptive feelings that can trigger active responses in the shape of uninhibited, vigorous action. And they are toxic in terms of threatening social peace. I think we need to take these emotional dispositions, especially dark emotions, seriously as the key triggers of violent behavior. And even if emotions are felt individually, they are always framed and expressed collectively. And there are obvious similarities here, I would say, with the concept of memory. Emotions are also occur at the level of the individual, being shaped at the same time by specific social and cultural contexts. And this collective and public aspect of emotions is captured in analytical concepts that have emerged in the history of emotions, such as, for example, Barbara Rosenwein's notion of emotional communities, or William Reddy's concept of emotional regimes. So people act on these emotions, leading to feedback processes and sort of a constant, as Reddy calls it, navigation of feelings in social interaction, which may alter the emotional fabric of the self and of society. Hence, these emotions or dark emotions may be regarded as embedded within particular institutions and social groups. Barbara Rosenwein's notion of emotional community starts from the idea that key social institutions, such as the family, the workplace, for example, schools, student fraternities, the military, develop their own situated sort of emotional codes, which members learn to comply with. And so the analysis of conflict and forms of political mobilization through an appeal on particular emotions has to take these emotional codes into account. This also means looking at the role and impact of the modern media, as they are the key vehicles for, let's say, the evocation and transportation of collective emotions, which may trigger in turn collective action. So as I said before, one can distinguish between negative and dark emotions. Negative emotions I would define as being more or less passive. They can be characterized as a form of silent suffering, perhaps, combined with symptoms of social withdrawal and helplessness. Dark emotions, on the other hand, are far more active, eruptive, collective, and potentially toxic in their effects. So it is, I think, difficult to draw a very clear boundary between the two because they blend into one another. So a passive emotional state, negative emotional state such as grief, can easily morph into an active one, and vice versa. I have a film clip that I could show in this context, but I think I only have 30 minutes, so perhaps this time I could show that later. So hence, I would say individuals may experience sort of a sequence of emotional states which are difficult to control. Dark emotions being much more radical in that they transform suffering into a drive to retaliate or take redemptive action. dark emotions can be contagious, I argue, and come in collective waves in which people fall sort of under the spell of such emotional responses. And they may be attracted to such dark emotions, as indulging in them may be somehow comforting or lustful even. So it is liberating to give free rein to these radical feelings, as Uffe Jensen argues in his book Zornpolitik. For those of you who don't know German, this is a book that sort of analyzes the rise of Pegida and AfD in contemporary Germany. So lingering resentment can be discharged or acted upon through dark emotions such as anger and hatred. They start to drive action, turning a more or less passive state of real or imagined victimization into the active moods. Hatred is one of the most radical responses, directed at an enemy who is seen as so powerful that he will destroy us if he gets a chance. And this bleeds then into the felt need to remove and destroy this particular enemy. And hatred is also commonly linked to the sort of an emotional disposition of envy, the impulse to begrudge others better fortunes, as was theorized in psychoanalysis by Melanie Klein. So envy is bound to greed, let's say, something that can be observed also in the case of Eastern Bosnia in '92. In the beginning of the war and the ethnic cleansing that happens. And it produces the powerful drive to take whatever the despised and hated others possess on the basis of an entitlement we believe we have on their possessions. As some anthropologists have argued, cultural elaborations of group envy are indeed very common in the organization of large-scale violence. And ultimately, the violent elimination of a hated and envied enemy is experienced as a form of catharsis, a cleansing of the mind of an intolerable state of rage. And I'm using Klein's concepts of splitting and projective identification. It is argued by other anthropologists as well that these psychological mechanisms play a role in explosions of ethno-religious hatred and violence. One group starts to, let's say, impute malevolent traits like aggression, hatred, greed to another proximate group of others, and then proceeds to mobilize the traits it ascribes to these others as a justification to inflict violence, understood as essentially preemptive. So a key ingredient of this psychological state is the image of the self as threatened, insulted, or victimized. I don't know how much time I have, but I would like to now turn to Eastern Bosnia.
Like 5 minutes or so?
5 minutes, okay. Oh. The Srebrenica genocide being sort of the culmination of this these kind of processes I've just described. So I would say it includes sort of a built-up or sequence of collective affective states that leads to the perpetration of a genocide. In my previous book, I argued that the massacre has to be understood as something that occurred in a particular location at a particular moment in time, presenting it as the outcome of a kind of a local dynamics that did not happen the same way in other parts of Bosnia. And I still stick to this kind of approach. And in my book, an important theme was indeed the theme of revenge. In any case, try to shorten a bit my talk here. At the time that when I did my field work in '97, between '97 and 2001, the massacre in itself, I mean, it just happened, let's say 2, 3, 4 years before, was impossible to discuss with local Serbs, as I was basically doing interviews in Srebrenica, Bratunac, etc. It was clear that no Serb was ever going to tell me what had happened in July 95 and what had been their own involvement in these executions. What could be discussed, however, in great detail was how they had been victims themselves in the Ottoman period up till the World War II, or the first year in the Bosnian War, 92, 93. And so I heard a lot of stories of how relatives had been killed in these, in these various wars. And from their perspective, from the local Serb perspective, let's say, renewed victimization had announced itself at the start of the 1990s when, let's say, state collapse, economic crisis led to a sense of fear, worries for the future, growing existential insecurity. And then with the elections of November 1990, Serbs started to be really anxious for their future in an area dominated demographically and politically because of the result of the elections by Muslims. Muslims formed an electoral majority, and so Serbs feared that they would soon lose control over jobs, economic assets, and other material resources in the course of the anticipated post-socialist wave of privatization. So in this combination of real existential fear and reimagined historical resentment, I argue, translated itself into darker emotions and nationalist political designs for collective remedial action that informed the brutal ethnic cleansing campaigns carried out in 92. Nevertheless, Srebrenica is a specific case, and specific for the situation Srebrenica was that Muslims organized a very effective resistance, seizing back control of the town in May 92 and reconquering territories in the following months. And so the Srebrenica enclave became a refuge for tens of thousands of Muslims displaced from many villages across eastern Bosnia. And many men joined, let's say, the irregular forces led by Nasser Oric, attacking Serb positions and villages and increasing the territories under their control. And these attacks also involved civilians in search of food, which was unavailable in the besieged enclave. And so most Serb villages, which are scattered, which are small and scattered sort of widely across the hills around Srebrenica, were unable to withstand this overwhelming force of armed attacks in which also thousands of unarmed civilians participated. And for a year or so, we're talking about May 92 up till sort of March or so 93, Serb villages and hamlets were exposed to these attacks, and many Serbs had to leave their houses behind and go to Bratunac, Serb-held Bratunac, or flee to Serbia. So on the part of this, the Serb population, there was this deepening sense of powerlessness and exasperation, I would say all negative emotions, which translated into revenge fantasies on the pages of Naša Riječ, which is, I have an image here from Naša Riječ, where you see a map of burned down and destroyed Serb settlements in these months from spring 92 to spring 93. And the turning point in this was the Muslim attack on the local Serb stronghold of Kravica on Orthodox Christmas in 93. Here's an image of at the end of this attack, let's say, led by Nasser Oric, in which 46 Serbs were killed. Most of them were combatants, but also a dozen or so civilians. So in this sent a shock wave through Serb-held areas in eastern Bosnia. It triggered actually sort of Mladic's first attempt to take Srebrenica in spring '93, which was stopped by the international community. And grief and humiliation sort of transformed itself into calls for revenge, which can be seen, which can be gleaned, let's say, from the pages of this local newspaper, Nasha Rijeka, which published contributions in which, let's say, local Serbs express their determination to settle accounts and deal a final blow to the Muslim side as soon as that possibility would arise. So this desire for revenge, the grief turns into revenge. As I argue, this belongs to the realm of dark emotions. I think I will probably stop here. I had a few more theoretical things to say at the very end on the concept of revenge as a problematic analytical idea, but perhaps that's something we can discuss in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Ger, for this impressive talk. As for the Q&A, I would suggest that we do it like last time, that we listen to both talks first and then have a joint discussion, especially because both of you are speaking about memory. So I think there will be a lot of cross references. Vjeran, you are ready? Ger, could you?
Oh yeah,
stop,
I need to stop
sharing this
exactly.
screen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm ready.
You also have slides, I guess.
I do.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Ulf, for the introduction, and Ger for this really great lecture. It was very interesting, especially since some of my own work on Bleiburg is also dealing with, and memory of that is dealing with perpetrators being reimagined as victims. Your case was definitely a lot closer since it's a tighter time frame, and I've looked at World War II, but I think there's a lot of parallels. So thank you for many of the interesting insights. And again, I'd like to thank Ulf for pushing and co-organizing this series of lectures. And I think it's great that we're keeping this going, and hopefully also in the fall and including more students and so on. And my initial presentation was going to be looking at commemorations and some the commodification of commemorations, something I've already been working on a longer project. But then, due to all these sort of, I guess, controversies or scandals and a series of commemorations that were happening in Croatia in the last few months, I thought it would be more interesting to talk about the impact of this pandemic, the corona crisis, COVID-19, what have you, on commemorative practices. And I'll begin a little bit with some general introduction to some commemorative practices in the sense of them involving many people, involving sites of memory, and that what happens when we all have to go digital, because clearly commemorations often involve some kind of political rituals with interactions. I mean, here David Kurtzer, an anthropologist, also an historian, reflecting on commemorations and these ritual actions that are structured, standardized sequences, and is often enacted at certain places and times that are themselves endowed with special symbolic meaning. So one thing is to have a commemoration, for example, in the 1990s in Croatia, the altar of the homeland in Medvedgrad was the site for many of these commemorations, but then after that you see them actually going to these specific sites, whether it's Knin, Brezovica, Vukovar, etc. And really having participated in many of these commemorations over the last not only 4 years or 5 years of my project, but the last 10 years, really it's about going there and feeling a lot of these emotions that we've also heard about in this previous lecture. And I think Vukovar maybe is one of the most powerful places where not only is the number of people that are there and the remembrance of what happened, but the fact that you walk in this column for 5 kilometers from the hospital to the cemetery. So acting out and participating is really generating a lot of these emotions. So I think, you know, being there, participating is a very important aspect of commemorative practices. And also, you know, what are these sites of memory? And referring to Jay Winter and his text on sites of memory, and you know, suggesting that once a generation or people no longer participate in some kind of commemorative practice, sometimes these sites become invisible or disappear. And working with my students, we also know that monuments are invisible no matter how much a state or regime invests in them, but particularly if the people that are tied to that no longer go there. So if commemorations, you know, aren't able to take place in these sites, what happens to them? Do they fade into forgetfulness or amnesia even faster? So this image is from a village, a Serb village in Western Slavonia that was then inhabited by Croats from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the population simply changed, and this monument was just a piece of stone. You couldn't even access it. Another part of relevant to commemoration, sites of memory, and the specific cases that I'll be talking about 3 of them. The first image I had was of Jasenovac, but are the symbols that are used there. And also in Croatia over the last several years, symbols have been debated quite extensively, especially this Ready for the Homeland, Za dom spremni, and its ties to the Ustaša movement. And here are just some examples of the various symbols and how it's being replicated, especially the one up in the left-hand side, this Hos symbol, which was used during the 1990s, this paramilitary group, but was clearly referring to the Ustaša movement from World War II. And you can see this especially at Bleiburg, which is another example. And these then combine in public space, and you have, you know, symbols and monuments and commemorative practices, and then are embodied by a monument. Just 2 that I've drawn from many years of field work. One is maybe a classic World War II socialist era monument near Šibenik, and the other one is this U-shaped memorial dedicated to the Homeland War, but obviously referring to this Ustaša movement. This one was actually eventually removed after Novi List ran several articles about it. And moreover, about commemorative practices in Croatia, which those of you who have followed commemorations or these things, and what I've noticed, especially from fieldwork, is the sort of blurring of the narratives of World War II and the Homeland War. Here I give 2 examples. You can see this is from Knin on the Victory Day on the left, with a unit of Hos from the 1990s named after an Ustaša commander, Rafael Boban. Very, Za dom spremni everywhere, very clearly associated with the Ustaša. They were also singing Ustaša songs during this commemoration. They were stopped by police. This was 3 years ago. And from the souvenirs and the materials that you can see, they're celebrating Operation Storm, but they're also selling T-shirts for Bleiburg there, and this map of the NDH, or even an imagined map of the independent state of Croatia. If you look carefully, there's Istrias there and Sanjak, also parts that weren't really part of NDH. So there is this definitely blending, let's say, on the right-wing spectrum. But interestingly, even from the anti-fascist side, it's become more and more popular and common to say, in World War II, the partisans created the borders of Croatia, and in the Homeland War, the veterans and the branitelji defended it. So it's on both spectrums, this merging of the various narratives. And just from this former project that I had, Framing the Nation and Collective Identity. We analyzed 5 World War II commemorations into Homeland War commemorations. So we were mostly focusing on the speeches, but also looking at the participants. Again, these souvenirs, which I find very interesting. I'd like to do more on that for a future project. Talking about these speeches, we also looked particularly at these mnemonic actors and these politicians who are involved. This is an image from 2015, so a few of the previous actors and some of the up-and-coming participants. This was, in fact, the last commemoration dealing with, let's say, anti-fascism that the former president, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, had attended, there with the former prime minister and now current president, Zoran Milanović. So from our project research, we found that there were a lot of these mnemonic actors that were using commemorations to talk about the current state of affairs, but also framing it through either the anti-fascist narrative or this victimization narrative at places like Bleiburg and so on. So, I mean, 2 of them presidents from the SDP, it was Ivo Josipović, who then was replaced by Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, who was the HDZ, and then now we have it again, a left-wing president, let's say, Zoran Milanović, who in fact campaigned and was elected on a very well, forward-looking platform, saying that he wasn't going to continue these endless ideological debates. He was moving forward, which is in fact an interesting aspect of my story because, as we'll see, this lasted in a very brief honeymoon period. There was a lot of hope placed in the fact that Milanović, known for his very, emotional outbursts, he often speaks from the cuff. He doesn't read his the speeches that are prepared for him. He's a fighter. He was known for his character. Yet he had campaigned saying he's going to be a very neutral president, and in fact, he initially was. And this is coming on the heels of, let's say, a 5-year period in Croatia where memory politics and symbolic politics were constantly at the forefront. We had a president of the HDZ, Tomislav Karamarko, who, especially in 2015 and 2016, really ramped up this discourse of very ideological. The president, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, the former one, she was also had a number of, let's say, gaffes and mistakes dealing with these things. And then Milorad Pupovac, the top Serb politician, Croatian Serb politician, who was very, very active in memory politics. I personally think he was doing a very positive role because he was always referring to victims on all sides, but was definitely engaged in memory politics. And then the current prime minister, who was, well, re-elected on Sunday, as Wolf mentioned, who has, I think, successfully tried to stay back from this. And he's managed to rein in a lot of the right-wing elements of his party. And I think his strategy is always not jumping into this and letting others fight it out. So we can, on one hand, say, and criticize him for not taking a stand on these things, but on the other hand, he successfully managed to not get tainted by these ideological conflicts. So coming into the 2020 commemorative calendar, we actually had quite a change from in the past because we had a new president who had promised not to deal with these things. He had promised a normal Croatia, and a prime minister who seemed to have, avoided a lot of these more ideological pitfalls, even though that the last couple of years he was dealing with a lot of them. But as I said, on a very stepping back from it. So here's the 3 cases that I've decided to look at in this cycle, which following these commemorations of the last several years, World War II always starting up again in the spring. So the two main ones, Jasenovac and Bleiburg, and I've thrown in here a commemoration, which is generally not really known about that much. I mean, it's usually sort of like a minor commemoration, this Operation Flash, but it had particular impact this year. So Jasenovac's commemoration, it's the Ustasha concentration camp, known for its famous stone flower, or the flower, by Bogdan Bogdanović. And since 2016, because of these, let's say because of Karamarko and this increase in symbolic politics, revisionism even, there were actually, the commemoration had multiple commemorations, so it was divided. The representatives of Serb, Jewish, and Roma victims avoided it. Anti-fascist organizations also boycotted it. They had their own separate commemorations. A few people attended the main HDZ-led, the official government events. Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović would show up a day or two by herself without any fanfare. So this was constantly being in the attention of the media because it was divided. And then another sort of another controversy happened with the building and the erection of a plaque. It was dedicated to this paramilitary group, HOS, and some fallen soldiers of theirs. And in the lower left corner, you can see this HOS insignia with the Za dom spremni. So this is located in the village of Jasenovac, a few kilometers from the memorial site, with basically a slogan that was used by the perpetrators that killed the victims of that camp. So this was a huge scandal. It was located on the wall of a kindergarten, in fact. The government tried to claim that no, this was just a marginal event, but there were lots of protests. In fact, during the 2017 commemoration, there was this intervention in the actual commemoration. It continued to the division. And in a way, I would say the Jasenovac was being silenced because there were no more commemoration speeches. It was just laying of the wreaths. So it was constantly in the media, and even the international community realized what was going on, and this looked very bad for the Croatian government. And Plenković's response was to create this commission for dealing with symbols of totalitarian regimes. They spent a year thinking about it. They finally issued a statement, and they said that the Za dom spremni was unconstitutional, except in certain cases. So it was occasionally unconstitutional. So there was certain times when it could be used, but they never actually really defined when it could be used. So it was sort of like a half-hearted measure. In the meantime, the monument has been moved. So they moved it about 20 kilometers to a place where there's another Homeland War Memorial. You can see it in the background there. So this is now in front. But because nothing is simple in Croatian, all these layers, they actually put it next to a blown up partisan memorial. And you can see that on the right-hand side. So, you know, one controversy feeds another one. But anyway, it seemed like the situation had calmed down. The monument was moved. There was this document of dialogue that was issued. The actual government or the Parliament never actually acted on it, so it's really just, you know, savjetovanje. It's not really a legal document. It's just a suggestion for what to do, but they never really acted on the suggestion. And 2020, we finally have a moment of unity after all these years, 4 years of divided commemorations. They finally get together. Milanović, you know, promises this new normal. Plenković also seems to have, you know, convinced the various organizations that his government really believes in the anti-fascist values. We have this commemoration here. You can see it's socially distanced appropriately. There were no participants, and there were no commemorative speeches again. So in a way, a little bit of silencing, but okay, they've got these three, the Speaker of the Parliament, the President, and the Prime Minister. But just when it looked like it was finally over, the journalists go and talk to Milanović, and he says in the middle of his comments, referring to that monument, that's been moved already, the one to Novska, it should be removed, thrown away somewhere. It has nothing to do with the homeland war. So he uses this very crude kind of way of bacitiu. It should be, yeah, just thrown away is the way that it was said. And this creates a new explosion, especially by the veterans organizations who had actually been relatively, well, pacified, let's say, in the last couple of months and had accepted Milanović. But now symbolic politics enters the stage once more. And here we come to the second commemoration in Okučani. Okay, sorry, some people are leaving. Which, as I said, it's not really a very well-known commemoration. It commemorates this Operation Flash that took place in 1995 in Western Slavonia, before the more famous or infamous Operation Storm. And it was the 25th anniversary. There was a new memorial center there, this new monument that was being set up there. Milanović was going to go. It seemed, again, with the proper precautions due to coronavirus. They were told don't have too many people there with masks. And right as the wreaths are about to be laid, two of the members take their shirts off, and they have these Za dom spremni T-shirts and these symbols. Clearly a response to what Milanović had said. At Jasenovac. And in the middle of the Croatian hymn, he packs up and leaves. So this is an additional controversy because, should he have stayed a little bit longer, but he realizes this is a direct provocation. Now, as I mentioned, Za dom spremni can be used at certain places as the recommendation, where the members of these veterans had participated. Now, by 1995, this HOS unit had been disbanded and reintegrated into the regular Croatian army. So there was no HOS units at Operation Flash. And this gentleman wearing this unit or this shirt was never even a member of HOS. So it was clearly an effort to taint the commemoration and make Milanović look bad. He took the bait. And again, this created a huge controversy in the media. And we see that despite the efforts, or seemingly that due to Corona and due to this new government, this normality, symbolic politics is not far away. And the third example, again, will be of Bleiburg. This is the post-war, at the end of the war, massacres that took place when the Ustasha and other Quisling forces surrendered to the partisans. They were brought back into Yugoslavia, and for several months there were mass killings, executions, these death marches, and so on. And Bleiburg in Austria was the location of this commemoration since starting in the early 50s, but especially in the 60s and 70s as well, and then made official in the 1990s. And as you can see, it's a very large commemoration with people standing very close. So this is obviously a problem for the current pandemic. I mean, this is a precise place where you would get the COVID-19 virus. There's a lot of elderly people there. This was obviously not going to happen. Moreover, Bleiburg has some specific characteristics. First of all, it's located in a different country. It's located in Austria. It takes place on private property. This group, the Počasni Bleiburški Vod, bought property, and this state commemoration takes place on private land, which is problematic for many other reasons. It's also registered as a religious ceremony, but needs the Austrian Catholic Church to give it, to allow it to happen. So it's also been sponsored by the Croatian parliament, the Sabor, except for this brief period when the left was in power. So in addition to the fact that there's all these people there, it's also taking place in a foreign country, which due to the COVID pandemic makes it, there's a travel ban. It's impossible to go across. But moreover, and more importantly, in the last few years, Austria has been trying to ban the commemoration, or at least control it and limit it. and they've definitely banned the symbols. Now, you've seen some of these other symbols that I've shown earlier. The two symbols that are banned are these two, which almost no one uses, in fact. The one on the left is in the flag, but usually just the U is used. And almost nobody uses this bomb symbol. I mean, it does show up, but it's not really the one. So, in any case, the commemoration has already been banned even before the corona crisis. Here we see from about 10 years ago the Austrian police doing nothing about Ustasha symbols being used. Now it's been changed. Because of the situation, they decided to have 3 commemorations. A small one in Bleiburg, let's say the main one in Mirogoj, the cemetery in Zagreb, and a third one in Sarajevo. So we can see the police wearing the masks. This is, I guess, commemorating in the age of Corona. So I attended this one, and it was actually very difficult to even see the commemoration because it was only for 50 invited guests. You can kind of see in the bottom right-hand corner, I had to use my zoom lens to even get some kind of images. The cemetery was destroyed still from the earthquake. There was lots of, you can see a lot of damage from the recent earthquake. But this Počasni Bleiburški Vod, not to be stopped, they actually went to this, you can see them also lining up there at that monument, not really doing social distancing at all, but okay, they participated. So this was relatively ignored, or it did not really cause much issue. However, now because it's really transnational, and because it was going to be in the Sarajevo Cathedral, this created a huge backlash. Many of you probably have heard about this. I mean, it was in the press for days, weeks beforehand, and resulted in a large counter commemoration or protest, and all throughout Sarajevo. I wasn't there because I was in Mirogoj, but I followed it a lot on social media, etc. And I think it's interesting, and this raises a lot of issues also, why in Sarajevo, and it, it created this huge backlash. And one thing I think is the dealing with the past in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I think maybe because of the strong presence of the war in the 1990s, I think aspects of dealing with the past haven't actually taken place, and probably these communist crimes. Maybe the Croatian population in Bosnia-Herzegovina has dealt with it, but I think in general there's still a lot of this Yugo nostalgia going on. And in my own communications with NGOs and working with people in Sarajevo, and when I brought up, oh, what about communist crimes, I was told, don't dig into that, that's opening up a huge can of worms. So these were young people willing to look at Bosnian or Bosniak crimes, Croat crimes, Serb crimes throughout the 1990s. Truth needs to be told, but if you suggest that the partisans committed some crimes, they're like, no, that never happened. So it's that, and which was, quite an interesting response. And secondly, the fact that the Bleiburg commemoration has been using so many Ustasha symbols for the last 20 or 30 years. There's been no real effort to honestly look at some of this, and it's been a subject of manipulation for so long. Of course, any mention of Bleiburg is immediately going to be associating it with the Ustasha. Again, regardless of the fact that there were actual victims of communist crimes, but it's been so manipulated that that was the initial knee-jerk reaction. And I think maybe going in further, are the ethnic relations in Bosnia-Herzegovina itself. Now I'll just wrap up and some final reflections. I mean, this is not really something that I've completely fleshed out because it's sort of more of a report as things are going on. But I would just like to think, if COVID-19 or whatever other pandemics, continue, and commemorative practices simply have to change, will there be some kind of loss of this connection with sites of memory, with this emotional participation? How are commemorations going to be looking like in the future? I mean, maybe it's a positive thing in a way. And speaking also with a colleague, Orly Friedman, she's been looking at this digital commemoration, particularly in Israel, and Israel and Palestinian relations, but even before, I think with this in Prijedor, they had a number of online commemorative practices, and the Srebrenica commemoration will be in a few days. How is that going to take place, and so on. So I think this is a new way of analyzing or looking at commemorative practices that don't take place in the actual space. And I couldn't resist, but I had to throw in some reflections on what's going on in the United States, Black Lives Matter. So this systematic discrimination and racism in the United States, combined with the economic consequences of the corona crisis. We've seen this explosion, and we've seen these attacks on the monuments, the removing of monuments from Confederate generals and leaders. I was in Richmond, Virginia last year and saw Monument Avenue, and was not so much shocked by General Lee, but really Jefferson Davis, who's basically led a government against the United States. And seeing them coming down, but this going on, attacking Columbus and other elements. So I think I'm just going to end there. Maybe there's some discussion we can chat about some of these ideas. So thank you.
Thank you, Vjeran, for this interesting talk and the very, very recent and current observations. And I think both of you gave us enough further for a discussion. And we still have like 20 minutes at least. And I invite you to ask questions to both our speakers, Ger and Vjeran. Either you raise your hand, or you throw in this yellow hand, or you use the chat function, but make yourself just recognizable.
There were a bunch of hands I saw.
Yeah, I think this was the applause.
Oh,
So
okay.
who wants to go first? Okay, Isabel.
Hey, thank you. Very interesting, both presentations. I have a question for Ger. I was wondering, methodologically, you hinted already at it when you spoke about Biljana Plavšić. Seeing as you're dealing with court records, a lot of it, basically, how do you disentangle motivation from the fact that a lot of the statements or testimony may have been given under the status of suspect, or basically facing legal consequences, and the warnings that would have been given when being asked questions on such a status?
Yeah, that's a very important methodological question. I don't know exactly how I'm going to solve this, but I think it is, of course, it's characteristic for any kind of use of a historical source, and I believe that one needs to apply source criticism and be very reflexive about the way in which statements can be tainted or can be manipulative in some way or another, like Plavšić's, let's say. I think it also means, in my view, that one has to read a lot between the lines. Yeah, so one shouldn't take any statement at face value. And one has to select, I think, that's the way I look at it, select particular statements or particular days in the procedures of the trial, or perhaps see the kind of developments that happen in a trial, to explore these emotional dispositions and the way they're used, because I think some of these emotions, as I've argued, are actually are used as a justification. I think that's also the problem of the concept of revenge, in a way. Yes, I've used this concept in my book, it's one that is used by. I mean, let me just say that when I published the first monograph in 2002, there was a general denial amongst Serbs in Bosnia and in Serbia that something bad had happened in Srebrenica. And there was even no attempt whatsoever to say, yeah, this was an act of retaliation or revenge. No, these were just, you know, the argument that in this time was that these were unfortunate, whatever, victims of armed exchanges between Muslim fighters and Serb fighters, let's say, which was, of course, far beyond the truth, let's say. And so my sort of explanation in 2002 did not have any resonance in the public sphere on the Serb side, let's say. And then, you know, it slowly started to be used as an argument, which made me feel uncomfortable. That I had been basically explaining something with reference to revenge, and so it became actually in Serb sources or in Serb responses to the Srebrenica events, a kind of argument a lot of people have been using. Yeah, the Muslims did all sorts of bad things before us, and so there was, you know, it's bad what we did, but there was some sort of moral justification to it. And so you see this again, you know, revenge being a kind of, as I call it, dark active, you know, dark emotion. Is also constructed or has an element of construction, and can be used and instrumentalized in particular contexts, such as a court setting, I think. Yeah. So
yeah.
You know, the key methodological problem I will have, I guess, is actually to I mean, there are only two people that have actually pleaded guilty. Or three. Wait a minute. No, yeah, it's Deronic and it's Erdemovic and yeah, three. And it's the police officer, Georgievich, I think is his name. And they've pleaded guilty, and the rest hasn't. You know, so the trials are very much in the key of trying to negate and deny any kind of involvement in all of this. So that's another methodological problem. So, but I must say I haven't managed really to systematically look at that trial, at the trial records, because the first step was actually to reduce it from around 400,000 pages to 150,000. Yeah, so just to make a first selection.
Okay, thank you.
Who want to go next?
Well, I'll ask a question.
Everyone's so intimidated by your talks, I guess.
Yeah, I
go ahead.
A question then to Ger. How do you think the commemoration will take place this year? Do you have any reflections about that or thoughts? Will you be following it intimately, or?
I'm not following it intimately. I basically have written on these commemorations in the middle of the 2000s. I mean, in the Bosnian Mosaic, the book you probably know, and I mean, it made me felt so upset in many ways, these commemorations, that I keep a certain distance from it, I must admit. You know, I've never been at one of these commemorations, and rather not go there. And I also wouldn't want to make any statements now on what I think about the 25th anniversary, because I think the whole topic has been so politicized, instrumentalized from various sides, and it's kind of a minefield. I mean, Srebrenica is a minefield in many ways, and I personally want to stick with what happens, you know, in those years, let's say between 89 and 95. That's where I want to focus on, and I forget about all the memorialization that's happening. I mean, that's for other people to do, I feel. Yeah. So it's not a satisfying answer at all to your question, but yeah.
Rainer Liedtke had a question.
Yeah, I take all my courage and I ask Ger a question. I mean, it's very convincing what you're saying about perpetrators feeling victimized and drawing strength from that, and obviously. But don't you think it's necessary to make sort of different categories of such perpetrators? Mm-hmm. Because the Serbs or Bosnian Serbs perpetrating something in Srebrenica, they have somehow experienced violence against them from their future victims, and some of them to quite an extent. Whereas historically speaking, I can imagine quite a few groups, for example, Jews all over Europe, who have not been a real danger, but an imagined danger for Germans and other Europeans being against them and participating in the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. So, but isn't that a completely different category of relation between victims and perpetrators then?
I mean, you know, to put it simply, I think that one has to, indeed, what you say, make all sorts of distinctions between the kinds of perpetrators that were involved. I mean, it's one thing to talk about Mladic, and it's a very different thing to talk about someone like Erdemović, who was not a Serb, yeah, but who was the first one to be convicted of participation in the executions. So that's an individual that doesn't fit the model that I have been presenting in a sense, but who was, you know, who was drawn, sucked into the war somehow, and against his own designs, you know, but ended up participating in the executions. Yeah, so you have a whole spectrum, I think, of people that were involved with various motives, I think. Yeah, they may have had victim, how I say that, relatives, casualties in their own family. They may have thought, you know, I mean, some paramilitaries coming, like the Scorpions coming from Serbia, were basically professional, dirty fighters, if you can call them like that, who just were people that sort of enjoyed committing violence, killing people. You have these kind of motives, that it may be a kind of a fun thing to do. So I think that indeed, but it will be very hard to quantify this, or let's say to say, you know, we actually don't know much about the perpetrators in the case of Srebrenica. So we have a few concrete examples of people who've spoken out, but most of them haven't, and are not willing to talk. Which is, in a way, the same happened for long after World War II, I think, yeah, and it took quite a bit of persistent research, or also looking at ego documents, for example, to find out, you know, how people actually ended up participating in such things like Wehrmacht soldiers in the Ukraine or so, yeah, with Christopher Browning's work, or. And I think we also need to wait to see whether these kind of ego documents will emerge, or will sort of come out of the closets, you know, in the coming decades. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure they must exist. I don't know, but I completely agree with you that there is a variety of motives, from very mundane, very instrumental, utilitarian, to real fear, how do you say, let's say, greed, or so all these different motives may play a role, or may combine. May, you know, there may be more of it happening in one individual. So, and I have no illusion whatsoever that with my research I would be able to give a full picture. I think I can just scratch the surface. No?
I have a question to Vjeran, because it seems that one of the differences in your approaches, Ger and Vjeran, was that Ger was speaking a lot about emotions, and I think Vjeran, you were basically talking. You started with saying something about ritual as a social action embedded, or like being symbolically overdetermined, and then you ended by saying that maybe because of social distancing rules, the wars over memory in Croatia will kind of fiddle out because people just can't go anymore to these rituals. So, but how much emotional investment is there actually, so that these memories would live on even if you can't practice a ritual, but because you are emotionally so invested in these things? Because indeed, I mean, from my very superficial observations, it does seem that going to Bleiburg, going to Jasenovac is like, you do that, but not necessarily because you care a lot.
Yeah, and maybe, you know, in fact, the digital realm allows even more emotions because we see these debates and people are constantly commenting. Any kind of thread starts and everyone's, you know, you get to Partizani and Ustasha within like 3 or 4 comments, you know, regardless of what the topic is. So in a way, maybe the digital sphere, in fact, just feeds the emotional aspect. But I think there still is this, you know, authentic element of, you know, going to a place. You know, why do veteran organizations travel from Rijeka all the way to the middle of Lika and the nowhere on these like mine-infested roads, like literal minefield, because I was there 3 weeks ago, to lay a wreath on some tiny little monument in the middle of nowhere? You know, time, effort, you know, danger because you're going out there, and so there is certainly some kind of investment in these rituals, and maybe also for older people, especially maybe again veteran groups, whether it's from the partisan groups or from the Croatian War of Independence, to go and see their old comrades. So there is a certain community building aspect, but maybe you're right. Maybe using emotions was not really, it wasn't a very sophisticated conclusion that I had thrown out there, but I guess there's certainly more room to think about how the lack of these authentic spaces and going to these will affect the nature of commemorative practices. Maybe not necessarily less emotions, but you know, what if the people who are 75 years old or 85 years old don't have access to, you know, digital tools? They don't get to go to these commemorations this year. And so on. So I think there's part of the whole point of commemorations is being lost. Now it's maybe being taken over by people who simply use it for instrumentalization or arguing, because they're not even really going there. And you're right, maybe many people don't go there, but they think of themselves as experts on the subject.
Right. Okay, any other questions? Take this chance to ask 2 eminent specialists.
Ulf, if you, I don't know how much, when you want to finish, but I still have this clip of about 3 minutes.
Yeah, we should finish basically at 3:30,
okay,
which is in 5 minutes. So if there's no immediate question, then why not watch Ger's clip and then call it a day?
Yeah.
Yep. Can you share it?
This is a clip from a film made in 93, made on the Serb side, and it shows a woman, and I think it illustrates, you know, a woman who lost her son, Serb woman, and it kind of shows the both aspects, I think, of what I've called negative and dark emotions. It starts basically showing the dark side of things, and it ends with the negative type of emotion. So it's perhaps slightly shocking, but I need to share the screen.
Yes.
Here it is. Share. And
Okay, although this is not a very optimistic end
No.
For today's session, but indeed very impressive movie. This was from a documentary here? Or?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I think the documentary is called The Unforgiving by Clive Gordon.
Mm.
A British filmmaker, I think lives in Berlin actually, but I've never spoken to him personally.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then thank you all for participating. We will resume our lecture series in the fall because at least in the Rijeka, they already started with the summer break while we are going on teaching until early August, just for you to know, Vjeran, how privileged you are. And see you again. Goodbye.